The barracks at 0400 hours smelled of sweat, shoe polish, and the stale anxiety of 60 men who knew they were about to be broken, while the rest of Platoon 304 was still groaning into their pillows, trying to steal the last seconds of sleep before the lights snapped on. Private Julian Harrows was already awake. He sat on the edge of his bunk, illuminated only by the red glow of the emergency exit sign, carefully taping his feet. Julian knew he wasn't like them. He didn't have the broad shoulders of Private Vance or the natural aggression of the farm boys from the Midwest. Julian was lean, academic, and physically lagging behind the curve. Every mile of the ruck marches felt like a personal war against gravity. Every push-up was a negotiation with his own trembling muscles. To survive, he had learned to be meticulous. If he couldn't out-muscle them, he had to out-prepare them. "Lights!" screamed Drill Sergeant Miller, kicking a metal trash can down the center aisle. The cacophony was instant. Julian moved with quiet efficiency, his locker organized to the millimeter. He was invisible, or he tried to be. In basic training, attention was a weapon, and Sergeant Miller wielded it like a cudgel. "Move it, ladies. The obstacle course doesn't care if you're tired," Miller roared, stopping at the foot of Julian's bunk. He leaned in close, the brim of his hat scraping Julian's nose. "Harrows, you look pale. You gonna faint on me today?" "No, Drill Sergeant," Julian replied, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach.
"I think you are," Miller sneered, loud enough for the whole bay to hear. "I think you're a liability looking for a place to happen. Vance?" "Drill Sergeant," Vance shouted from 2 bunks over, grinning as he laced his boots. "Keep an eye on Harrows. Make sure he doesn't trip over his own shadow." The platoon chuckled. It was the sound of the pack turning on the runt. Vance walked past Julian, shoulder-checking him hard enough to knock him back against the locker. "Don't worry, Sergeant," Vance whispered, his voice dripping with mock concern. "I'll make sure he doesn't get hurt. He's fragile." The march to the course was brutal. Cold rain lashed against their ponchos, turning the dirt road into a river of sludge. Julian marched in the rear, the heavy rucksack cutting into his shoulders. His lungs burned and his legs felt like lead, but he kept his eyes on the boots in front of him. Just one more step, he told himself, just one more. He wasn't here because he was strong. He was here because he had nowhere else to go. He needed this discipline. He needed to prove that he was more than just the quiet kid from the library. But as they arrived at the confidence course, looming like a medieval torture device against the gray sky, Julian felt a cold dread settle in his bones. He wasn't just fighting the obstacles today, he was fighting the expectation of failure, and the audience was waiting for the show to start. The Weaver was a monster of wet timber, an inverted V-shape of logs that required a recruit to weave their body over and under, hanging suspended by nothing but grip strength and grit. In the pouring rain, the wood was slick as ice. The platoon watched as the first group went through. Men slipped, cursed, and scrambled, but they made it. Then Miller blew his whistle. "Harrows, Vance, you're up." Julian stepped up to the starting log. His gloves were soaked. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Next to him, Vance looked bored, flexing his massive arms and winking at the guys in the line. "Go!" Julian lunged. He pulled himself over the first log, his movements jerky and desperate. He wasn't graceful, but he was moving. He slid under the second log, hooking his legs, dragging his weight up. He could hear Vance moving effortlessly beside him, the bigger man practically vaulting the structure. "Come on, Harrows," Vance jeered from above. "My grandmother climbs faster than this." Julian gritted his teeth, ignoring the laughter from below. He was halfway up. He was doing it. He reached for the highest log, the apex of the structure. He needed to swing his leg over to secure his position. But as he shifted his weight, his bottom boot slipped on a patch of moss and slime. It happened in slow motion.
Julian's grip on the upper log failed. He fell backwards, but his right leg remained hooked through the gap in the timbers. The torque was absolute. A loud, sickening crack, like a dry branch being stepped on, echoed through the clearing. It was louder than the rain, louder than the shouting. Brutal and vengeful. Julian hung there for a split second, suspended by his broken leg, before the limb twisted free and he plummeted 10 feet into the mud below. He hit the ground with a wet thud. The air left his lungs. For a moment, there was no pain, only a white-hot shock. Then he tried to move, and the agony tore a scream from his throat that silenced the entire platoon. He rolled onto his back, clutching his leg. It was bent at an angle that defied nature. Sergeant Miller walked over slowly. He didn't run, he didn't look concerned. He stood over Julian, looking down with a mixture of disgust and vindication. "I told you," Miller said, his voice cutting through Julian's screams. "I told you you were a liability." Vance jumped down from the structure, landing lightly. He wiped the mud from his hands and looked at Julian writhing in the filth. "Man, look at him," Vance laughed, shaking his head, crying like a baby. "Hey, Harrows, did you break a nail too?" The laughter rippled through the ranks again. They didn't see a tragedy. They saw the herd thinning itself. They saw weakness being purged. "Get a truck," Miller barked, bored. "Get him out of my sight before he infects the rest of you." As the medics finally loaded Julian onto the stretcher, he looked up through the tears and the rain. He saw their faces. Vance was smirking. Miller was lighting a cigarette, already looking away. They weren't just dismissing him, they were erasing him. To them, Julian Harrows was just a cautionary tale, a joke to be told in the barracks later that night. The ambulance doors slammed shut, sealing Julian in the dark. The pain in his leg was blinding, but the fire in his chest was hotter. They thought this was the end. They thought he was broken. But as the darkness took him, Julian made a silent vow to the ghost of the man he used to be. "I will come back, and when I do, you will not be laughing." 7 years later, the rain of Fort Jackson was a distant memory, replaced by the choking dust of the Petch River Valley. The platoon, now Delta Company, was no longer a group of fresh-faced recruits. They were tired, hollowed-out men, worn down by a 9-month deployment that had taken too much and given nothing back. Staff Sergeant Vance sat on a crate of 5.56 ammo, cleaning dirt from his fingernails with a knife. He looked older than his 28 years. The arrogance that had defined him in basic training had been replaced by a nervous twitch in his left eye. Beside him, Sergeant First Class Miller, the man who had once ruled the barracks with a voice like thunder, was now just a weary NCO trying to keep his pension intact. They were leaderless. Their lieutenant had been evacuated 3 days prior after stepping on an IED, leaving the unit in a dangerous limbo. "I heard the replacement is coming from 2nd Ranger Battalion," Miller grumbled, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Probably some high-speed glory hound who wants to win a medal before he goes home." Vance nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Great, just what we need. Another cowboy who doesn't know the terrain." The thumping of rotor blades cut through the stagnant air. A Black Hawk helicopter banked sharply over the ridge, flaring aggressively as it touched down on the small landing zone. The dust storm kicked up by the wash blinded them for a moment. When the air cleared, a single officer walked down the ramp. He didn't walk like a cowboy. He moved with a terrifying, predatory economy. His gear was stripped down, customized and worn, the sign of a man who lived in his kit. He carried his rifle not as a burden, but as an extension of his body. As he approached the gathering NCOs, he removed his sunglasses. Vance froze. The knife slipped from his hand, clattering onto the rocks.
The face before him was harder, leaner, and marked by a jagged scar running from jaw to ear. But the eyes were unmistakable. They were the same eyes that had looked up from the mud 7 years ago, filled with pain and humiliation. "Captain Harrows," whispered Miller, the name catching in his throat like a fishbone. Julian Harrows didn't smile. He didn't blink. He stopped 5 feet from the men who had once treated him like garbage. He looked at Miller, then at Vance. There was no anger in his gaze, only a cold professional assessment. He was looking at them the way a mechanic looks at a broken engine, identifying the rust, the wear, the inefficiency. "Sergeant Miller," Harrows said. His voice was no longer the soft, hesitant tone of the recruit. It was gravel and iron. "Your perimeter security is sloppy. I saw 2 blind spots on the approach. Fix it." Miller stammered, his face flushing red. "Sir, we've been short-handed." "I didn't ask for excuses," Harrows interrupted, stepping into Miller's personal space. He towered over the older man now, radiating a quiet, lethal confidence. "I asked you to fix it, unless you want your men to die in their sleep tonight." He turned to Vance. The big Texan, once the bully of the squad, shrank under Harrows's gaze. Harrows looked at Vance's unbuttoned collar, his dirty weapon, his slumped posture. "And Vance," Harrows added, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream, "you used to have a lot to say. Do you have anything to say now?" Vance swallowed hard, shaking his head. "No, sir." "Good," Harrows said, turning his back on them to walk toward the command center. "Briefing in 10 minutes. Try to keep up." Miller and Vance stood in the dust, paralyzed. The broken toy had returned as a war machine, and the shift in power was absolute. They realized with a sinking dread that the man they had mocked was now the only thing standing between them and the enemy.
The test didn't come in weeks, it came in hours. At dusk, the valley erupted. It started with the crump of mortars walking toward the wire, followed immediately by the chaotic chatter of heavy machine gun fire from the ridges above. The enemy had been watching the leadership changeover and decided to test the new captain. Chaos threatened to swallow the base. Men were scrambling for cover, shouting conflicting orders. Miller was frozen behind a sandbag wall, screaming into a radio that wasn't connecting. Vance was firing blindly into the dark, wasting ammunition, panic rising in his chest. The unit was breaking. They were reacting, not fighting. Then a voice cut through the noise. It wasn't shouting, it was projecting. "Vance, suppression on the North Ridge, 2 o'clock. Miller, get that radio up or get off the net." Captain Harrows was standing in the center of the compound, exposed, moving with a calm that bordered on insanity. He wasn't cowering, he was conducting the battle. He ran to Vance's position, grabbing the staff sergeant by the shoulder and physically turning him. "Stop shooting at shadows," Harrows barked. "Look at the muzzle flashes. Controlled bursts. Do it." Vance, jolted by the command, focused. He saw the flashes. He fired. He hit. Harrows didn't stop. He moved to the mortar pit, kicking a crate of ammo to the gunners. He moved to the comm specialist, grabbing the handset and calling in coordinates for artillery support with a mathematical precision that stunned the men around him. He knew every distance, every angle. The meticulousness that had made him slow in basic training was now the very thing keeping them alive. "Incoming! Get down!" Harrows roared. He tackled Miller, throwing the older man into a trench just as a mortar round impacted 10 feet away. Dirt and shrapnel sprayed the air. Miller lay in the mud, gasping for breath, looking up at the man on top of him. Harrows pushed himself up, shaking the dirt from his helmet. He looked down at Miller, the man who had once kicked mud in his face when he had a broken leg. "Are you done hiding, Sergeant? Because I need a soldier right now, not a spectator." Miller nodded frantically, shame burning hotter than the shrapnel. "I'm with you, sir. I'm with you." "Then get to the heavy gun and cover the east wall. Move."
The battle raged for another hour, but the dynamic had changed. The panic was gone, replaced by the rhythm of discipline. Harrows had imposed his will on the chaos. When the Apache gunships finally arrived to sweep the ridges, the enemy broke and ran. Silence returned to the valley, heavy with the smell of cordite and adrenaline. Later that night, the adrenaline had faded, leaving only exhaustion. Harrows sat on the ramp of the command post, cleaning his rifle. Vance and Miller approached him cautiously. They looked like children called to the principal's office. Vance cleared his throat. "Sir?" Harrows didn't look up. "Status. Casualties are light. 2 wounded, stable. Perimeter is secure," Vance reported. He paused, struggling with the words. "Sir, about today, about before." Harrows stopped cleaning. He slowly reassembled the bolt carrier group and slid it back into the weapon. The metallic click was loud in the quiet night. He finally looked up at them. "You want to apologize," Harrows said. It wasn't a question. "We were young, sir. We were stupid." Harrows stood up. He didn't look angry. He looked past them, toward the dark mountains. "I didn't come back for an apology, Miller, and I didn't come back for revenge," Harrows said softly. "I came back because I'm good at this, and because someone has to make sure men like you don't get everyone else killed." He walked past them, stopping briefly at the tent flap. "You mocked the recruit because he fell," Harrows said, not looking back. "But you forgot the only part that mattered. I got back up." Dismissed. He disappeared into the tent, leaving Vance and Miller standing alone in the dark. They had once looked down on him. Now they would spend the rest of their lives looking up, knowing that the man they had tried to break was the only reason they were still breathing.